So we've all heard the phrase hidden gem, a term mostly used to describe, in this case, a good show that doesn't have a big audience. When I hear hidden gem, shows like Scavenger's Reign, Common Side Effect, which is still airing right now, and Barry, which I covered in my previous video, so make sure to go check that out, come to mind. But amongst those phenomenal shows, one in particular stands out to me, and if you read the title of the video, you already know what I'm about to talk about: The Midnight Gospel. Created by Duncan Trussell and Pendleton Ward, the show follows our lovable main character Clancy, a deadbeat 20-something-year-old trying to start his own spacecast, a space podcast. How does he do this? Well, by traveling to different universes and interviewing people whose worlds, according to Duncan Trussell, are on the brink of extinction. It's pretty cool. But here's the kicker: as crazy as it may seem, the show is actually real. Not the cosmic apocalyptic stuff, the conversations. Because it turns out almost the entirety of the Midnight Gospel, apart from a few exceptions, is just Duncan Trussell's Family Hour podcast animated over with some of the weirdest, most psychedelic visuals imaginable. Meaning the whole premise of the show is just the real people having real conversations, and that's why I love it. If I had to describe the Midnight Gospel, I would say it's adventure time, but on a crazy, ridiculous amount of acid. And this makes sense because Pendleton Ward, the creator of Adventure Time, co-created, directed, produced, and wrote for the show, so you kind of have an idea of what to expect. So to give you a quick rundown on how the Midnight Gospel got created, according to Duncan Trussell, he had been doing his podcast for a while now when he hit a rough patch in his life. But that's when he got an email from Pendleton Ward. In the email, Pendleton told Duncan that he was actually a fan of the podcast, which Duncan found hard to believe at first because, funny enough, Duncan was also a fan of Pendleton's work on Adventure Time. The email eventually led to them grabbing a cup of coffee and later becoming friends. Pendleton was actually the one to bring up the idea for the Midnight Gospel, and while he had a rough idea of what exactly he wanted, him and Duncan spent some time brainstorming and shaping the concept. After the initial meetup, the show wouldn't get made for years because Pendleton had other commitments, and according to Duncan, this actually broke him, as in his mind he thought this was never gonna happen. But after some years, they met up again and created a concept piece, a 2-minute clip which eventually would become the first episode, and they showed that to Netflix, and the rest is history. Now onto the actual show. Going back to what I said in the beginning, the Midnight Gospel follows our main character Clancy, your average broke 20-something-year-old trying to start his own spacecast. Clancy lives in a dimension called the Chromatic Ribbon, where simulation farming is common. People who own universal simulators use them to travel to different dimensions and extract resources, whether it be technology, material, or other valuable stuff. Clancy, on the other hand, owns a second-hand rundown universal simulator, one so damaged that every dimension it generates is either in the middle or just experienced an apocalypse. That makes it practically useless for farming, so instead he uses it to visit the apocalyptic worlds and document it for his spacecast. Funny enough, as I dive deeper into the show, I think when Clancy first bought the simulator, he originally intended to be a farmer like everyone else. Clancy gives off the vibe that for a while he tried to do his own thing, you know? He feels like the type of guy / character who didn't even want to go to varsity or get a job because he wanted to do something different, and you know what? You can't blame him. But it just seems like it never worked out for him, and in a way he was eventually forced to face reality, and he did what he thought was best for him. I mean, he even borrowed money from his sister hoping that buying the simulator would be a worthwhile investment. But when he realized the simulator was too damaged to serve its original purpose, he decided to make the best of it, which is something I really love about his character. Instead of giving up, he pivoted and turned a failing investment into something unique. With that said, it's not exactly paying off. He's broke, he's struggling to pay his sister back, and his home is basically a small trailer floating in a vast, colorful void. In all honesty, Clancy isn't doing so hot, but that just adds to his charm. I like how Clancy is literally just Duncan Trussell but in animated form. The show is episodic and not at the same time. We don't spend much time with Clancy and the world he inhabits, as the main purpose of the show is pretty much to focus on the podcast of it, and that's practically the whole point of it. The only reoccurring things in the show is that Clancy is avoiding his sister and that some powerful rich guy wants to kill him because he bought his son ice cream. What makes The Midnight Gospel so unique isn't just that it's a podcast turned animated series, it's how it blends those two elements together. In most animated shows, the dialogue fits the visuals, but here, the visuals are their own thing. They're separate from the dialogue, yet somehow they still manage to tell their own beautiful story, and it perfectly complements the conversation. The conversations are real, they are deep, they are philosophical, and sometimes even emotional, while the animation is straight up chaotic. You could have someone talking about death, meditation, the meaning of life itself, while on screen, Clancy is either fighting a zombie horde or turned into mincemeat by a giant clown. Yeah, it shouldn't work, it's too overwhelming. But some way, somehow, it does. The contrast between the visuals and the conversations make it feel almost like a lucid dream, where you're absorbing all this deep wisdom, but your brain is also trying to process the absolute madness happening in front of you. At first glance, you would think this show is just a trippy, existential podcast with some cool, weird visuals on top. But the more you watch, the more you realize there's something deeper happening. Throughout the show, there's one recurring theme: acceptance. Accepting the chaos that comes with life, accepting the pain, accepting the unknown. Clancy keeps running from the real world, diving into these strange apocalyptic universes looking for answers. And just like real life, the conversations he has don't always give him the answers he's looking for. Clancy is a struggling content creator. He's broke, plus on the other hand, he owes his sister God knows how much. Apart from wanting to be a spacecaster, Clancy is actually struggling. Clancy is struggling with avoidance and escapism more than outright confusion about his path. He knows what he wants to do. He wants to explore, he wants to have deep conversations, he wants to make his spacecast. But he avoids confronting his real issues. His universe hopping and spacecasting serve as a distraction from actually dealing with his emotions, his responsibilities, and his personal growth. It's like he's searching for meaning externally while he's refusing to acknowledge what's right in front of him. He also struggles with accountability. We see this in how he dismisses criticism. Whether it's from his computer, which warns him about dangers of his recklessness, or his sister who calls him out on all the bad decisions he makes, and as she says, she doesn't care about the money anymore, she just cares about him. Instead of facing these issues, he keeps running, immersing himself in trippy adventures where the stakes don't feel real. He's not directionless, but he's avoiding something deeper, whether it's emotional wounds, fear of failure, or simply the weight of reality. His journey isn't just about finding external wisdom, but also realizing he can't avoid his own truth. Because I feel like we would have gotten more time to actually explore not just Clancy as a character, but his family dynamics and more about the story apart from the actual universe hopping. In all honesty, the show doesn't really feel like it has a structured narrative. Clancy jumps from universe to universe, having deep thought-provoking conversations that explore big philosophical questions, discussions that work amazing as a podcast, but in terms of a larger story, there isn't much outside of Clancy's slow character progression and the few moments where he genuinely engages with the real world. But despite this loose structure, everything comes together beautifully in the final episode, Episode 8. Episode 8 is what I would describe as the most heartbreaking episode of television I have ever seen in my entire life. This is where everything clicks. The final episode of The Midnight Gospel is a conversation between Duncan Trussell and his real mother, Denning Fending, who was battling stage 4 breast cancer at the time and who sadly passed away 3 weeks after recording the podcast in 2012. It is quite honestly one of the most beautiful episodes I have ever seen. It's not just a podcast episode, it's not just a cartoon. It's a goodbye, a real goodbye. This looming presence of death was something their family had to live with every day for years, and that weight is felt in every word of their conversation. But instead of drowning in fear, she embraces it. She speaks about death with a calmness and a wisdom that is both comforting and devastating. The conversation they have is heartbreaking. As someone who has a loving relationship with their mother, this hits home. The idea of having this kind of discussion, especially under those specific circumstances, is beyond terrifying. During that conversation, Duncan's mom talks about how she accepted her faith long ago. The only way she could go about this kind of situation was to accept it, and she did. She says that she even went to a cremation service and sorted out all the arrangements so her family wouldn't have to worry about them when she eventually passed on. She had accepted her faith long ago, but you can tell Duncan, or in this case Clancy, is struggling to come to terms with that. Like every episode of the show, it is jam-packed with good stuff, thought-provoking conversations that any person who might find themselves in a dark spot or a rough patch in their life would benefit from this. As much as how the conversation is wholesome, it does take a turn when Duncan does bring up his mother's illness and how it has taken a toll on him over the years, which I can only imagine. It's emotional. He gets emotional and she comforts him, telling him that she's going to pass away and it will hurt. And Duncan asks his mother, what do you do then? And she says, honestly, the most motherly thing any person could ever say.
But come on, there's no way to stop the heartbreak. What do you do about that?
You cry. You cry.
The conversation, it carries so much weight that it's both a farewell and a lesson on life itself. The way this is depicted in the show is beyond incredible. It's the perfect depiction of what a mother-son relationship would be like if it got animated. I will say this, it's also pretty weird. I mean, it literally starts off with Clancy being born and this is where the conversation begins. We see Clancy grow as his mother gets older and she eventually passes away. But then the circle of life continues as Clancy falls pregnant and gives birth to his own mother. I mean, it is incredibly strange, but beautiful at the same time. I mean, they end up going to this weird contraption where they both dissolve into cosmic dust, forming planets and being pulled into a black hole. It's a visual representation of the very thing they're talking about. Life, death, acceptance, and the circle of life. At this point of the show, you're no longer watching the Midnight Gospel. Clancy isn't a character anymore. It's just Duncan Trussell talking to his mother. And it's beautiful. At its core, The Midnight Gospel isn't just an animated podcast with some trippy visuals. It's a meditation on life itself. It takes existential questions that we all struggle with. Death, purpose, suffering, acceptance, and it explores them in a way that feels deeply personal and universally relatable. Clancy's journey is Duncan's journey, and in a way, it's also our journey. We all seek meaning, we all avoid things we don't want to face, and we all experience loss. But if there was one thing the Midnight Gospel teaches us, it's the chaos of life isn't something to be solved. It's something to be embraced. The show may have been cancelled after only one season, but trust you me, its effects will last on forever. Whether you see it as an absurd, psychedelic mind trip or a profound exploration of the human experience, The Midnight Gospel is something truly special. Funny enough, I've been planning to make this video for years now because I watched The Midnight Gospel like a couple of years back and it's just now that I actually decided to make it. If you haven't seen The Midnight Gospel, please do yourself and everyone around you a favor and just go watch it.